Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
Earlier this month, a one-of-a-kind artifact was presented to the St. Louis Kaplan-Feldman Holocaust Museum. It is a small object physically, a 2-inch wide metal bracelet, but it has a remarkable history.
Here's a 14-year-old boy surviving the most frightening and horrific of life circumstances, and I'm sure nobody gave him that piece of metal and said, "Here, want to make a piece of jewelry."
So, Dan, this was found on an archaeological dig. I understand this dig was happening in a forest. Do you have any theory of how this bracelet from Ben could have ended up there?
Did he discard it knowing that he'd be searched and he just decided to get rid of it on his own? Had it been confiscated and seen as something of no worth and thrown away? Everything is sort of what's likely to be, what could have been.
You know, being embraced by people and being heard was very meaningful to him, and knowing what his family, the loss of his family and how they suffered, and what happened to humanity was, he really took on the importance of sharing that story.
Joining me now to tell the story of the bracelet, its creator, and the reason it ended up here in St. Louis is Sharon Barry. Sharon, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest in my father's story.
So Sharon, we're going to talk a lot about your father here in the coming minutes. I understand that he went by Ben Fainer during his decades in St. Louis, but back in Bedzin, Poland, he had a different name. Tell me about that and what you know about your family's roots there.
Well, over the past couple of years, I've learned quite a bit of information that I previously was unknown. So my father was born Bendyt, it's Bendyt, Bendyt Ehrman, and that was his mother's family name because his parents were married in a synagogue in 1930, and that was very common then. They didn't have a civil union, so he carried his mother's family name. And the Benik, which is the Beniek, is like a Polish spelling of Bendyt.
Okay, so he was Benik Ehrman. The family was there in Poland, and they were Jewish. Obviously, in the 1930s, that became a huge problem. When did they find themselves facing possible deportation to a camp?
Well, the exact date is unknown, but what is known is that in September of 1939, the Germans invaded, occupied, and ghettoized most of Poland, and then began the next few years deporting Jews to work camps, concentration camps, and extermination camps. So from the research that I've done, I'm really still unsure when that exact date was. Probably about 1941, maybe 1940. There was a census taken that was finished in 1940, and my father and his family is listed in that. But the exact date that he was taken to the Klobuck work camp, I have not pinned that down yet.
And before he was sent to this work camp, do you know if the family made attempts to try to get out of Nazi-occupied Poland?
None that my father shared with me, but recently I received, I saw in one of the groups on Facebook something called the Lados list. It's spelled Lados, and whenever I'm kind of a research geek, and when I see pieces of information, I'm always looking for family information and for a picture of my grandmother that whom I've never seen a picture of, and other information. And so I looked at this list, and my heart stopped
Mm.
to see my grandmother's name on this list. So it appears that she had reached out to whomever the contact was in Benton in this underground network. There was this whole organization, humanitarian effort to get forged passports into people's hands, and then
Mm.
so they to prevent deportation.
And so she was trying to get out, and your understanding is that that was not something she was able to do for herself or for that immediate family. Is that right?
No, no, because the date of the request that she made and when the people came back to contact her, she was not found to be found, were what the notes were, and she had already been deported.
And so you said your father ended up at this work camp. Do we know what happened to his mother and to siblings that he had at that point?
Well, the last time my dad saw his mother and siblings is when, they were separated, whatever date that was, and he was loaded on a work truck with his father and stood and, watched his mother and sisters, and that was the last time he saw them. Um, Possibly, it could have been 1942 when his mother was deported. Some people were found useful to the Germans because they could, provide labor in whatever factory they were still running in Poland. But a woman with 3 children probably was not seen as a candidate
Mm-hmm.
as being useful. And there were no records of Hannah being ever in a work camp. My grandmother and her young children, and as my father described, she just poof, they were gone.
And so that's just a terrible thing that happens. Your father, another terrible thing, he ends up at this work camp. I understand this was a satellite to Auschwitz where he was. What do you know about what he was doing within that work camp?
So Bletchhammer was after Klobuck, and I'm unsure if there was something else in the middle. And that's where he was tattooed sometime, after, April 1944. It appears that he worked in a locksmith shop or in a metalworking shop
Hmm.
while he was there. And, the bracelet itself is, so interesting that he, made this. Here's a 14-year-old boy in the, surviving the most frightening and horrific of life circumstances. And I'm sure nobody gave him that piece of metal and said, "Here, want to make a piece of jewelry."
Mm-hmm.
Um, he probably stole the metal, and at different points in time, because you look at it and you can see there's different tools that were used, and there's, several, the decoration, and just several pieces of work. So it's not likely that it was all done in one sitting.
Mm-hmm. So he might have been just sneaking work on this at the point that he was doing some metalworking within this locksmith shop for his captors.
I think so.
So he had a pretty complicated journey, as many of these things ended up being at that time. He was ultimately imprisoned in 6 different camps. How did he end up in Buchenwald?
In January of 1945, before Auschwitz was liberated, there was a death march out of Auschwitz and the satellite camps, which was Bletchhammer, where my father was, and that was a 12-day walk in very cold weather without, shoes and boots, to a camp called Gross Rosen. It is believed that he was there for about 5 days, and then transported on a train, but they were open coal cars from Gross Rosen to Buchenwald, and then he was in Buchenwald then until that was February. He arrived in Buchenwald. of 1945.
Okay, so that's February of 1945. When did the Allies show up at that camp and he was able to be liberated?
Well, the Allies showed up, I believe, around the 11th of April, and the camp had already, as they described, self-liberated because the Germans had left.
Hmm.
And my father, despite his young age, still at 14, was in the group of prisoners that was, again, marched out of Buchenwald because they were still intending to, carry on and take prisoners that were still alive and that could work. So my father was in that group that was marched out. So the camp was liberated around the 11th, and my father was on a road heading towards Cham, Germany, when the Americans arrived on the road.
And did he understand at that point what was happening, that this was the end of being under the Nazis' thumb?
From what he wrote in his book, he describes it as, he didn't know that, he thought it was the end, that he was going to be shot. He thought it was the end, and then some people came up to him and were speaking to him in English, and my father did not speak English. He spoke a little German, Polish, and Yiddish, and a man came up to him who spoke Yiddish and told him that he was free.
This was an American soldier who maybe knew Yiddish from home?
An American soldier from Brooklyn. His name was Israel Friedman.
And so at that point, he's free. However, I know this was such a tough experience for so many people. It wasn't like, oh, hey, and here's your ticket to the U.S. He ended up going to Ireland, then a number of countries before he finally ended up in St. Louis in 1957. What brought him here?
Well, before he even, to go back a step, before he even left Germany, he was in a DP camp, and
displaced
many
persons.
people, right, and many people actually died that had been liberated because they were starving, and the Americans gave them food and they died from the food. So it was very, very, very bad. So my father was in more than one displaced person camp because he was looking for his mother and looking for his family. And so he's traveling around Germany, going from place to place looking for his family. And then I think with the help of the Red Cross or other agencies, then they reached out to his aunt and uncle who had left Belgium before the war and were in Ireland. So he was in Ireland, met my mother, went to see a cousin, then he moved to Canada, to Montreal, where there was a distant family member, and then came to the States, to St. Louis, because his father was here.
So, Sharon, you're giving us so much history here, and it's great to hear how this journey ended up unfolding. I understand this is not something you grew up knowing. When did your father first begin to really open up to you about all of this?
Well, it wasn't until my father began speaking, and that was 1994, I'm thinking, is when...
So almost 50 years after these events.
Yeah.
Was it hard for him to tell this story?
Well, initially he had no interest. He was very stubborn. He had no interest in sharing his story. He kept it, repressed it and kept it bottled up for years, and that's what he wanted to continue to do.
But that
was not the case.
We're talking today to Sharon Barry. Her father, Ben Fainer, was Jewish and lived in Poland before being imprisoned in 6 different concentration camps as a teenager. We need to take a quick break, but we'll continue this story with Sharon when we come back. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. Today we're discussing an artifact's journey from World War II era Germany to St. Louis. And that story is also the story of Ben Fainer, who was imprisoned in 6 different concentration camps as a teenager after growing up in Poland. And we're talking today to Ben's daughter, Sharon Barry. Sharon, as you said, your father didn't speak much about this for decades. And then ultimately, he ended up doing a lot of speaking about it. He even wrote a book about it. What changed, do you think, that he went from being so reticent about this to really feeling that this story was something that had to be shared?
Well, when he first started speaking, I think just the slowly opening up and the healing process that, you know, just being able to share what had been bottled up inside him for so long, I guess he found it healing, and he was embraced by people, and he missed so much in his life. My dad said to my son once, he said, "I was never a teenager. I was a prisoner." So he missed so much nurturing that most people have, and there was a big hole in him. In addition to the other psychological and physical damage. So being embraced by people and being heard was very meaningful to him, and knowing what his family, the loss of his family and how they suffered, and what happened to humanity was, he really took on the importance of sharing that story.
Well, we have another guest today. This is someone who got to know Ben Fainer after he began to actively speak about these experiences, and that is Dan Rich. He's the curator and director of education at the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. Dan, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Dan, is it unusual that Ben would wait so long to be ready to tell his story?
Yes and no. He actually titled his book Silent for 60 Years, which literally was true. That was not always unusual. A lot of survivors, when they came here, were told, move on, look forward, don't dwell on the past. They didn't want to have a dark cloud over their children. So many of them really did not speak until they felt they needed to share their story, that it was important that it not be forgotten. On the other hand, there were some who immediately felt it was important to share their testimony.
So, Dan, Ben ended up dying in 2016. In those final years where he was sharing this story so widely, do you think he took joy from that? Or maybe not joy is the right word, but do you think that this was a good experience for him to be out there doing that?
It is complicated. Definitely. Once he started, you couldn't stop him. He saw how important it was. He saw how telling his story inspired visitors, especially younger people, to learn the lessons of the Holocaust. And he was such an example of resilience, because after 6 camps and losing his family and suffering as he did, he also enjoyed life, and he communicated that he still was sort of someone who just enjoyed living, and it was so inspiring for so many people. Years after he'd passed away, visitors were still saying, "Is Ben here? We remember Ben." He really had inspired many, many people, and he knew that. And there was one incident when a doctor told him, "You must have surgery." And he said, "I won't, because I've got an appointment to speak to a military group coming to the museum," and he said he would not have the surgery till after.
He had his priorities.
He did.
Now, we're talking about Ben today, not just because of this remarkable life story, but also because of this bracelet. Now, earlier this month, this one-of-a-kind artifact was presented to the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. This is a 2-inch wide metal bracelet. Sharon, this was 2 years after your father's death that you heard about this bracelet for the very first time. How did it come to your attention?
A bolt from the blue. I, I got this email and I looked at it and I was like, my initial response was, what kind of sick joke is this?
You thought this was maybe a scam, somebody trying to give you trouble.
I was just stunned. I just, it was, I had, of course, no background information of anything like this happening. And then, I looked at the domain where it came from. I, Googled the person and, it was just, yeah, it was real. And, we began communicating with them.
And what was this person saying in this email?
Well, they were just right to the point and said, your father was imprisoned here, and there was an archaeological dig that was happening in the early 90s, and this bracelet was found, and there was some words lost in translation from German to English because they referred to it as a badge, B-A-D-G-E, not a bracelet, and there was a picture attached to it, and this is kind of like, wow, they knew it was my father because they, because he had done a video for the museum and it was out on the internet, and the foundation that we set up to remember my father. There was also information that had the same name and his prisoner number there, and that's how they contacted me.
And this was his name from when he was in Poland that was on this bracelet, a name he hadn't used in years. Is that right?
Correct, because he made it when he was 14. That was his name.
And we do want to mention for people curious about this bracelet, we're putting a picture up on Twitter. That's STL on air. We'll also get that on our website, stlpublicradio.org. Sharon, this is a pretty small bracelet, metal, and had his name on it. Anything else that made it notable to you?
Well, no, his prisoner number, did you say is engraved in it, the year that it was made. And then there's a 28 in the other corner, and I don't know if that was a camp or that he was in at Lechhammer or if it was a bunker number. I don't know the significance of it.
So, Dan, this was found on an archaeological dig. I understand this dig was happening in a forest. Do you have any theory of how this bracelet from Ben could have ended up there?
Theories, yes. But did he discard it knowing that he'd be searched and he just decided to get rid of it on his own? Had it been confiscated and seen as something of no worth and thrown away? So it's all in the realm of theory. He never spoke about this bracelet. So everything is sort of what's likely to be, what could have been.
So, Sharon, I think it's worth mentioning, too, you got this email in 2018, but this bracelet was actually discovered in the 1990s. It sat in a box for the final 2 decades or so of your father's life, and before they contacted you with this. Do you wish you could have gotten a chance to ask him about this?
Oh yes. Oh, yeah. There's so many questions that,
And what led them to finally reach out after all that time and to send you this email that was a bolt out of the blue, yet somehow took decades to send?
Well, the person that found the bracelet, he took a picture of it, and he was cleaning his office. His name is Dr. Sven Baer, and he was cleaning his office, and he found the picture of the bracelet, and he contacted the Buchenwald Memorial and asked them whatever happened to that, and then Google searches ensued, and that's how they, found my dad, and because he's out there on the internet, and found me, and just the timing of it is, maybe somebody could have contacted us in the 90s, but I'm sure that the museum there in Germany, the museum was new, and there weren't the resources then that there are now, and it wasn't meant to be.
It's interesting because that feels like a near miss that they didn't get it to you just 2 years earlier. But the other near miss might have been if he hadn't been so public speaking out about his life, it might have been impossible for people to connect that name to you and to find you today. Do you ever think about that you might never know about this if not for the fact that he'd become such a public speaker and wrote this book?
Yeah, that's possible. That is possible.
Dan, it's just a remarkable story, and I know you probably hear so many remarkable stories in your line of work, but what strikes you about hearing about Sharon finally getting this bracelet after so many decades?
Well, remarkable indeed. Sharon called me when she first was contacted, and I was like, what? You mean they're willing to give? I had a lot of questions, but I said the bottom line is, when you get the bracelet, when you travel to Germany, when you get it, when it's all worked out, whenever you're ready to give it, we're eager and honored to accept it. I knew even 2 years ago that this artifact would have a very, very important place in our Holocaust Museum because Ben had such an important place at our museum. So timing, yes, it would have been wonderful earlier, and again, to be able to ask Ben about it. But one other good timing is we're in the middle of a major expansion, and we'll have an entirely new permanent exhibition, and this artifact will have a very important place in our permanent exhibition when we reopen in summer of 2022.
So you'll be able to tell some of this story, not just display the bracelet, Dan?
We will tell as much of the story as we can. Again, I said, when you're ready, we're ready. This culminated, in the last week or two. And I'm still eager to sit down with Sharon. We've talked about this a great deal over the years, but really document and record all of the details of acquiring the bracelet. And I also want to make sure we speak to the people at Buchenwald so that we can get as complete a picture as we can about this bracelet. There'll always be some unknown questions, but we will try to get as much information as we can. And as I say, it will be highlighted on view in our new museum, which opens next summer.
So, Sharon, it's great to hear about the museum's plans to highlight this bracelet. But I imagine different people could have come to different decisions about what to do with this artifact. I imagine you have so little from your father's years in Poland. What made you decide that a museum was the right place for this, not to just keep this to yourself?
Well, I didn't really feel that it belonged to me. It was, the St. Louis community, the Holocaust Museum was such a part of my father's life. It gave a whole new meaning to his life, the last 20 years of his life. And just to go back to one thing that you were saying about why didn't my dad speak and other survivors, there wasn't really an opportunity for them to speak. There was no venue. And so no one was really interested in hearing what people had to say. So when the museum opened in 95, and when Marcy Rosenberg met my dad and took his video testimony for the USC Shoah Foundation, and that community lifted up the survivors here in St. Louis, and just and so to have St. Louis is one of a handful or two handfuls of cities in the country that have Holocaust museums, and to have such this community here in St. Louis is, it was everything for my father. And the bracelet was my father's. It's my father's story, and it belongs in a museum, not in a box, and not in my drawer.
Well, Sharon Barry, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and just sharing this story and sharing so much about your father's life. I'm just so touched by everything you've shared today, and I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
And Dan Rich, Curator and Director of Education at the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. Thank you.
Thank you. When people ask about Ben when they come in now, we can show this bracelet, which tells his story.
And what a remarkable ending to what a remarkable tale. Thank you for that, Dan.
Thank you.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.